It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first panel of our conference on religion and the global politics of human rights. As many of you know, the Berkley Center is relatively new to Georgetown. We have been around now exactly a year. The center is devoted to the interdisciplinary study of religion and world affairs across a range of thematic areas: international security, democracy, development, questions of culture, and dialogue. And our topic today, human rights, really cuts across all of these areas. It's incredibly complex. It also cuts both ways, if you will. We have examples of religious communities at the forefront of the struggle for human rights. Around the world, we have examples of religious communities impeding that struggle in various ways. And those of you who were here with us last night, we had a wonderful keynote by Kenneth Roth of Human Rights Watch, the executive director who really built that organization into a global powerhouse, and who has wrestled with these questions on the ground for the better part of 2 decades. And yesterday's keynote was an opportunity for him to reflect and to try to think through this intersection on the ground in places as far-flung as China, South Africa, and Chile, to explore the possibilities for collaboration across the religious-secular divide in the area of human rights. And we're going to continue that conversation today. We're not going to be able to sort through this complexity once and for all, but we do want to try to bring together in an interdisciplinary fashion these two spheres, religion and human rights, that are not always juxtaposed. And when they are juxtaposed, they're often juxtaposed in a very oversimplified fashion, with an emphasis on sort of scripture and theological precepts on the one hand, and secular and philosophical principles on the other, and then sort of general questions: is religion compatible with human rights? Is one religion more compatible than another? We'll keep those questions in mind. We can't avoid them, but we want to go deeper. We want to look at the politics of human rights, the religious politics of human rights, and how communities around the world, different key world regions, are engaging human rights agendas, how they're interacting with each other, with secular actors, with states, with international organizations. We've got a great panel this morning to kick things off with a focus on Latin America and Africa. And what I'll do is introduce our panelists, ask them to speak for 10 to 12 minutes each. I'll then have some comments, some questions for them, and we'll make sure to leave time for you, for the audience, to pose your questions, and we'll finish up at noon. To my left, I'd like to introduce Paul Freskin, who holds the Vicar Chair in Christian Perspectives on Political, Social, and Economic Thought at Calvin College. He's written very extensively on the impact of evangelical movements in the developing world. I'll mention 2 of his most important publications: Evangelical Christianity and Democracy in Latin America, published with Oxford in 2006, and before that, Evangelicals in Politics in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, with Cambridge University Press, 2001. He'll be speaking to us today about religious pluralism, democracy, and human rights in Latin America. To his left, Rugaya Mustafa Abu Sharaf, an anthropologist, director of the Pembroke Center's research initiative on gender and traditional Muslim practices at Brown University. Among her many publications, I'll again cite just 2. One is entitled Wanderings: Sudanese Migrants and Exiles in North America, published by Cornell in 2002. And more recently, I think just earlier this year, a volume that came out, a very important book with the University of Pennsylvania Press, on female circumcision, multicultural perspectives. To her left, Alfred Steppen, the Wallace Sayre Professor of Government at Columbia University, a political scientist. You see here, embodied next to me, the notion of interdisciplinarity. Paul comes out of sociology. He is, it's safe to say, our leading comparativist, comparative politics and discipline and political scientist, our leading comparativist looking at issues at the intersection of religion, politics, and democracy. He's also director of the Center for Democracy, Tolerance, and Religion at Columbia, and I'll just mention a couple of his books to make it clear that his expertise goes far beyond religion and politics to encompass democratic traditions, transitions, issues of multiculturalism, federalism, and so on, Rethinking Military Politics that came out with Princeton in 1988, and Arguing Comparative Politics, published by Oxford in 2001. He will be speaking on Islam and human rights in Senegal, rituals of respect, but also casting our discussion today at the conference in a broader analytical context. So thank you very much for joining us. I think probably best if you come up here for the sake of visibility and present at the microphone. Paul.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good morning. Latin America gives us a chance to examine two major Christian traditions, Catholicism, obviously, and Pentecostalism, growing rapidly more recently. The religious field of Latin America is changing quite quickly, more pluralism within Christianity and growing pluralism beyond it. And Catholic-Protestant tensions are absolutely central still in Latin America. This isn't a replay, however, of 16th century Europe, because we're not talking about top-down national reformations, but a bottom-up process of Catholic Christendom being transformed at the grassroots. Of course, the transformation of the Catholic Church in the early 60s into one of the leading institutional defenders of human rights was one of the great transformations of the 20th century. And the Latin American case takes precedence, because as one author says, on human rights issues, the Latin American church led the way for the whole church. But not only was Latin America central for the new global Catholic strategy, but the Catholic Church was also central for the emergence of a strong human rights movement in Latin America. And that's due to the almost simultaneous transformation in global Catholicism and the implantation of military regimes, very violent ones, in Latin America. And I would say that the Catholic Church has been, the Catholic contribution to human rights has been absolutely indispensable in Latin America since about 1970, despite inconsistencies from one country to another, despite the perceived gap often between what the Church demands of others and what it demands of its own internal life, and despite blemishes on its record with regard to religious freedom, especially its attitude towards the so-called sects, which basically means the Pentecostals. But this change happened in varying degrees in different countries, and in some countries it really didn't happen at all. Argentina, for example, which had a very brutal military regime, not only was the church silent, but basically it was hand in glove. The two best documented cases of church defense of human rights were those of Chile and Brazil. Clearly, in the Brazilian case, it was when repression began to affect church personnel that you had a change in the initial church support for the regime to opposition, and then really into a public position of the voice of the voiceless. However, that was the public face. There was also a private dimension, which was expressed through something called the Bipartite Commission, a secret committee of bishops and generals that met during the worst years of the repression. On human rights, there was no compromise in at the private level. However, the bishops did also bring other concerns, including divorce, birth control, and competition from other religions. Basically, the bishops pushed for a continued recognition of Catholicism as Brazil's semi-official religion. This was obviously, this public and mixture of the public and private was a role that only Catholicism could play, because only it had the mix of history, transnationalism, and elite connections, and could effectively balance a robust defense of human rights and avoid the full force of the regime's wrath. After redemocratization, well, human rights are now basically part of the political landscape, and that's thanks in a large degree to the Catholic Church's efforts during the authoritarian era. However, democratization has displaced the Church from its centrality with relation to human rights. Both civil society and the religious field have fragmented, and those two things combined have reinforced challenges to the Church's position and to concepts of its mission. This has led to varied outcomes in different countries again. In Chile, there's been a de-emphasis somewhat on human rights. Brazil, a continued emphasis, and a tremendous percentage of human rights groups in Brazil trace their origins to some form of social Catholicism. What about religious freedom in Latin America? Well, Latin America is really one of the freest regions in the world. However, there are still some countries where non-Catholic religions do not enjoy the same legal rights as the Catholic Church. There are still state subsidies to the Catholic Church in some countries, state funding only to Catholic universities, restrictions on non-Catholic missions in indigenous areas, and so on. What about the growth of Protestantism? Well, the growth of Protestantism in Latin America might be thought to be a hopeful development for human rights in the region. After all, Protestantism has historically had a closer relationship to human rights than any other religion. However, John Whitty's reminded us that one of the ironies of the contemporary human rights movement is the relative silence of the Protestant churches. It seems to me there are a few reasons for that. One, I think, is that the standard of comparison now is obviously with post-conciliar Catholicism, with its sophisticated theology, official magisterium, global articulation. Protestantism's divisions, which once enabled it to be in the vanguard, now work to its disadvantage. Another factor is Protestantism's dramatic recent shift to the global south in a largely autonomous process which has located it largely amongst the poor and less educated sectors. Now, this has had an effect as well. In Latin America, Protestantism developed with a strongly oppositional identity in relation to Catholicism, and its organizational forms allowed it to adapt very much to local interests and therefore go through a process of local subversion or local captivity of the church and isolation from international perspectives. I think it's significant that the examples of Protestant involvement in human rights work during military regimes, virtually all, if not all, are connected with ecumenical organizations, because the association with ecumenical organizations either gave an international connections or a link with the local Catholic Church, which made that activity somewhat less risky. The clearest example of an explicitly evangelical organizing in defense of human rights in Latin America comes from Peru. The National Evangelical Council formed a Peace and Hope Commission, largely on the initiative of university-educated evangelicals. The context for this was the Shining Path guerrilla insurgency and the violent army repression of it, and the immediate spark was a massacre of evangelicals by the army. One factor, I think, in this is the institutional strength of the National Evangelical Council, which is not typical in Latin America. Another is that as with many Catholic initiatives, violence against members of one's own religion was a catalyst to bring home the intolerableness of the situation. In addition, the conservative nature of much of Peruvian Catholicism meant that it hadn't preempted the theme of human rights to the point of making anti-Catholic evangelicals steer clear of it. In addition, the Peruvian situation was of extreme violence plus democracy. Outside the emergency zones, there was democratic space, and this was important for the involvement of a fairly poor religious minority in such risky activities. However, from the early 90s, the Peace and Hope Commission's space became more restricted within the National Evangelical Council, and I think there's a good reason for this. Nearly all human rights movements are led by middle-class intellectuals, and an official defense of human rights would open up space for the leadership of such people and would diminish space for other types of people. In other words, there's a turf war going on here. The mission of the church has to be what I have expertise in, not what I'm hopelessly at a loss in. So that there are problems in getting Pentecostals on board for human rights in Latin America. And an example of this can be seen in a brochure produced by the Brazilian National Programme on Human Rights called Religious Diversity and Human Rights. And this brochure, instead of seeking to establish a basis for human rights in the teaching of each confession, tries to construct a common creed which in effect approves of certain religions and disapproves of others, on the basis not of their actions, which would be fair enough, but on the basis of their teachings. So this is really an appropriation of the human rights discourse by a particular approach to religion, which is something of a pity because there seems to be considerable space for human rights emphases among Pentecostals, according to the Pew Research Center's survey last year of Pentecostals in 10 countries. To the question whether it's important that there be freedom for religions other than one's own, Pentecostals everywhere were at least as affirmative as the general population of their countries. On welfare, whether government should guarantee food and shelter to every citizen, second-generation rights if you like, Pentecostals everywhere are slightly more favourable than their general populations. And they favour also participatory government over the strong leader solution. There don't seem to be any problems of any weakening of democracy on the basis of Pentecostal attitudes. They reject the Christian country idea, favour separation of church and state, and so on. The clash between Pentecostals and Afro-Brazilian religions has happened, but it's rarely been violent. Rather, it's been a full-blooded religious dispute between social equals at the grassroots level, and I think that's important. They are social equals. There isn't a power imbalance affecting that relationship. Undoubtedly, however, some of the Pentecostal churches have often shown a lack of proper respect for other religions. However, the violence that troubles most Latin Americans today is of a different sort. Urban violence has worsened dramatically, affecting all Latin American urban dwellers, but especially those on the poor peripheries. And some anthropologists have pointed out, in the field of violence, certain religious interpretations have lost credibility, and others, especially Pentecostal ones, have gained it. As one anthropologist says, exorcism has become one of the most significant methods of dealing with evil in the shanty towns. In addition, as another author says, the transition from state violence during the military regimes to privatized violence today further encouraged a change of religion. While the transnational and hierarchical Catholic Church was better at combating state violence, the individual transformative power of Pentecostalism seems to do better against privatized violence. And my final point would be that for many Latin Americans, the concept of human rights surfaces most often in discussions regarding urban violence. Just last month, when I was in Brazil, there was a particularly horrific murder of a 7-year-old boy, which led to an acrid debate among intellectuals, in which, for perhaps the first time, a certain number of left-wing intellectuals abandoned the discourse that the criminal is the victim of society, a position that has always been difficult for the law-abiding poor to accept. Many of the law-abiding poor are, of course, Pentecostals, since they share precisely the social characteristics that allegedly make the criminals victims of society, but without becoming criminals themselves. On the other hand, the Pentecostal discourse as a discovery of personal agency, of empowerment through personal transformation, sits uneasily with a concept of human rights which appears to rob people of their personal agency and to transform them into victims of ineluctable social processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to thank Bancho for inviting me to be part of an important conversation about religion and human rights. My project deals with gender justice and religion in sub-Saharan Africa. And as Tom pointed out, it is really a broad overview of the main issues and the main topics that highlight the intricacies of religion and its role in the global discourse of human rights. My project focuses on the struggle for reproductive rights generally, and on the practice of female genital mutilation particularly, to examine the convergences of local and global arguments around a subject that is deemed fundamental to the attainment of women's rights. I contend that current efforts in sub-Saharan Africa to promote the endorsement of women's reproductive rights and sexual rights afford a productive space for illuminating the intersections of religion and human rights through an examination of current discussions around policy issues and statements, public declarations, non-governmental organizations' activism, testimonials, religious teachings, and other sources regarding the contested practice of female genital mutilation. This practice, whose justifications vary vastly across practicing communities in sub-Saharan Africa, in fact, is subject to numerous interpretations and meanings. And in my project, I try to argue that in combating or refuting any one of these justifications, you are likely to run into significant problems because these kinds of interpretations and meanings are closely intertwined. And that is important to know when we talk about eradication of harmful traditional practices that have been at the center of religion and religious discussions about the integrity of the body. Part of the power of religion is that it is taken as authoritative by adherents, so it serves as a potent solvent to other traditions. And like what Ken Roth said last night, that it is very important to look at questions of religion and global arguments and the human rights movements in terms of complementarity. So although we are aware that there are numerous tensions, and he pointed out the contradictions and of different dimensions of religious practice and human rights movement, we have to understand that it has tremendous power when you talk about eradication of practices that are really deemed harmful. The moral dimensions of religion, in particular, address the perceived connections between female genital mutilation and women's purity, chastity, virtue, and honor. So religiously based programs that seek to combat FGM often inculcate the view that sexual morality is achieved by women's own choices and values and not guaranteed by any surgical procedure. By dissociating notions of ritual purity and sexual morality from FGM, religious leaders play an important role in harmonizing human rights. Again, elsewhere I have talked in my paper in depth about different processes of localization and vernacularization as explained by anthropologist Sally Mary. So I think religion has been very important in different societies in sub-Saharan Africa in locating alternative explanations of gender politics that also lie beyond the modernity and tradition divide. So the vigorous engagement of religious leaders in the fight of rights is a highly effective strategy for promoting change. And not only is religion important in relation to other social institutions, but its complex symbolic significances and underlying social purposes contribute to its powerful influence on cultural attitudes, public policy, and the overall visions of self and society. So again, elucidating these convergences, I have to point out to some of the tensions, but with understanding these tensions, I proceed to show exactly how religious leaders are playing an important role. And as somebody pointed out, this has nothing to do with how personally you view religion, but how these communities really view themselves, their relationship to religious discourses, and what role do religious leaders play in the human rights movement by really exposing and promoting an epistemology of rights that is localized, that is vernacularized. Again, in explaining the convergences, we have to take into consideration serious issues raised by anthropologists, for example, James Ferguson, who talks about how we can't talk about experiences of religion and human rights without talking about Africa's involvement in global affairs. Questions of globalization and markets and so on are very important, and that, again, constrain choice. So this is one point that has been raised. But in response to that, I would say that African human rights activists, including opinion leaders and religious leaders, have conceded the importance of talking about human rights violations as violations. So they are acknowledging that there are serious contraventions and breach abuses of rights that have to be considered without really reducing the human rights movement to a Western liberal tradition that has no root in sub-Saharan African society. Last night, I think we have seen, we heard Kenneth Ross talking about that particular idea. So in terms of being part of a larger political culture in which there are values and beliefs and certain aesthetics about the promotion of human rights, religious leaders are quick to point out that with respect to the question of FGM, it is a mutilation of the human body that God had created in a perfect form. So they are going back to interpretations that consolidate the idea of the indivisibility of human rights and women's rights. There is, again, considerable emphasis on the questions of relativity and relationality. We do understand that when you talk about reproductive rights in the United States or in Europe, it is very different than when you talk about reproductive rights in Benin. You have to make sure that you are talking about specificities as well as commonalities. So in terms of articulating the reproductive rights movement, Sub-Saharan Africa had been part of the International Development and Population Conference in Cairo in 1994. And that has been really interesting and very important for mobilizing different civil society organizations, different grassroots organizations to talk about women's issues. Just like, again, last night when Roth talked about gay rights in Egypt and the problem of the Queen boat, and he talked about how they started to appeal to a wider audience in Egypt by talking about torture rather than the gays movement of gay rights. It's the same, there is something similar. People don't talk about sexual rights, okay, sexual rights, but they talk about notions such as safe motherhood. So you find that in places that being extremely conservative, like in Khartoum, for example, my hometown, I had very interesting conversations with people from Planned Parenthood International about how do you really talk about reproductive rights agenda in a country in which you can't talk about sexual health and sexual matters openly. But they have ways of really building certain kinds of alliances with local communities to make the point about reproductive health as a holistic state, not particularly about sexual freedoms. So in terms of analyzing the local notions about reproductive rights, I made the point clear, and this is hopefully what I would like to contribute further in terms of talking about this as part of daily negotiations and conversations. So when you talk to people about the issues of religion, human rights, and cultural difference, we have to take into account the different power structures and also local institutions. Are they really supportive of human rights? There is an interesting development with respect to highlighting the role of religion, which is the overall efforts in Africa. The African Union, for example, adopted a protocol on women's rights. It started, of course, with the African Union People's Charter. It went on to talk about gender-specific forms of violence. This, again, acknowledgement has empowered communities. And we talk about declarations. There are so numerous declarations in Africa that talks about abandoning harmful traditional practices, and female genital mutilation is part of that. So they talk about early marriage, they talk about sexual behavior, HIV/AIDS, and among other taboos and issues that circumscribe gender justice. So it has been very useful, as I said, at the level of declarations. You have enormous symbolic power around which people can actually mobilize. For the very first time, religion played a very important role in defending reproductive rights and drawing from these kinds of instruments. So I want to read to you the experience of a woman by the name of Simino Shure of Kenya, who was a former midwife, or they call it traditional exciser. Her experience was chronicled by a Ghanaian activist, Ecuador Kino. Here she highlights the decision to stop performing genital surgeries and how that had been really affected by religion and what was, again, the view of the clerics. So she says, the clerics told me that cutting off a woman's genitals is just as bad as cutting off any other body part, like a finger or an arm. Then they asked me if I would be able to see if someone took out my eyes. I said no. They told me that eyes are like genitals. Both are organs and both are part of us for a reason. They told me that if you deliberately remove someone's eye, you are supposed to pay 50 camels to them as compensation. Yeah, this woman, a Somali refugee in Kenya. So it's just the significance of camels. If you cut the labia majora, you are supposed to pay 40 camels, and another 4 for the labia minora. So I was supposed to pay 80 camels to each girl that I circumcised. I have circumcised so many girls, and I knew I couldn't pay that amount. I asked if there were anything else I could do for God to forgive my sins, and that I must go to each girl. They told me that I must go to each girl that I circumcised and ask for forgiveness. So it is very important, again, considering the role of traditional midwives and excisers, because different NGOs and even governments have such a hard time in convincing them in abandoning this important source of income. So it is important to understand how that is really taking shape. So in the 2 more minutes, okay. So the points that I want to make is that in sub-Saharan Africa, when we talk about the eradication of female genital mutilation and the institutionalization of reproductive rights as key measures for effecting gender justice, that the declaration passed by the African Union had really surpassed CEDAW, or the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Violence Against Discrimination Against Women. And that is really important. Why am I saying that it surpasses CEDAW? Because it has been very particular to Africa and African concerns, including the situation of women in armed conflicts, in peace building, in local practices, and so on. So it has been very hopeful. I'm talking about a situation in which, as I said, we have to recognize that we can't say, okay, these have helped people realize human rights, but I'm talking about the steps towards acknowledging that grave violations of human rights are really militating against nation building and development issues at large. So again, Tom asked the question that helped us really frame issues of gender justice, human rights, by asking the particular question, are human rights universal or are they products of specific cultures? And I want to continue by saying that also we can ask, are they mutually, when we talk about human rights and we talk about cultural traditions, are these mutually exclusive categories, or can they be understood as reciprocally interrelated matters, amenable to reconciliation by compromises that serve women and their communities? So I think there are positive developments in terms of religious leaders across religious frontiers, as we have seen that there is enormous collaboration between Christians and Muslims in the fight against HIV/AIDS in Uganda and in Arusha in Tanzania, in other places. So there is conversation, there are bridges that are being built across communities and across ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups to talk about the sanctity and the integrity of the body. So I will stop here and hope to discuss it further in questions.
To tell me 5 minutes before I should stop. Because once I get into it, I can possibly know.
That's my sit right here.
Well, first of all, I was here last night when Ken Rolfe spoke, and it was terrific. I happened to be in the first year of Human Rights Watch in 1981, and it was called America's Watch. And hearing the talk showed how far we as humans can actually go and think hard about some basic issues. And I'm thrilled to be here. You tell me it's your first year. And I have the Berkley Center, when it's had its 20th, it's been going as long as that, has a lot to contribute. I'm sure it will, and I'm thrilled to be here. My comparative advantage, I am interested in human rights, but my comparative advantage for this audience today is probably to focus on my work as an empirical democratic theorist, and trying to address these questions to the extent that they relate to human rights. And most of my sort of 10 books or so are in that area. Okay, and I'll try and, I read this morning the questions that Tom and Bob asked us, and I'll try to directly answer some of those. First, is democracy a necessary condition for the achievement of human rights in practice? No. What's important, absolutely a necessary condition, is you have a usable state. Because if you don't have a usable state, people may have inalienable human rights, but they're not defensive human rights. If someone violates your rights, it's only if you have a usable state that can come in and protect your rights. Now, that type of state could exist before full democracy is there. And any historian will look at the evolution of democracy. If you focus on the Scandinavian countries, for example, you'll see that really 50 years, almost 80 years before democracy is there, you have an increasingly law-bounded state where civil servants were subject to a whole series of rules, and groups in society, we would now call them civil society, had that expectation that if state officials violated their rights, there would be some sanctions against them. That was before full democracy. I think that's absolutely clear. You can have a lot of respect for human rights in different situations without full democracy. Second question. Do different forms of democracy lead to different ways of institutionalizing, extending, and restricting human rights? They absolutely do. But I'm going to argue well within the ground of countries that are democratic. It's useful for us to do that first. Well within the grounds of countries that are empirically democratic, there is huge variation that's often not observed and fully taken on board by people working in the liberal classic definition of democracy. For example, probably in the last 50 years in the English language, the most important political philosopher of liberalism is John Rawls. Now, it's well known that in his famous book on political liberalism, and I will focus on the book, he later changed his opinion on this in an article for the University of Chicago Law Review. But it's important that the leading liberal political philosopher of our time taught this course for about 15 years at Harvard, finally published this book, where he argued that if you have differences between overlapping comprehensive doctrines, if any part of this is from religion, which other people may differ about some aspects of it, they cannot possibly arrive at an overlapping consensus. Now that's what Rawls was into, creating an overlapping liberal consensus. So then what was Rawls' injunction? He says, in this case, if you're in a pluralistic society, and there are a variety of comprehensive, rational, but comprehensive, different overlapping doctrines, or comprehensive doctrines, the only thing you can do is take religion off the agenda. I was with a meeting with Jonathan 2 weeks ago. I asked Chuck Taylor on this one attempt. I said, Chuck, when you first read that, what was your response? Chuck's a great political theorist. He said, I thought it was absolutely tyrannical and illiberal. You can't say something like that. And that's my opinion. So that's the normative dimension of excessive demands of liberalism. We have to be somewhat cautious about it within the democratic tradition. And then empirically, there's an institution that many people feel is really close to this liberal part and should always be there, and that is total separation of church and state. Once again, this is just ahistorical in terms of any understanding of the history of democracy. It's not necessary. For example, I think we'd all agree that the most equal, the longest standing democracies in the world are the actually Scandinavian ones. Every single Scandinavian country has an established evangelical Lutheran church. So just right there, we can't say that the French and the American tradition is absolutely necessary. Now, the French and the American traditions are really close to a strong separation of church and state. But they're actually, and they're often seen as similar. But of course, they're totally different in origin and totally different in consequence. The French tradition really is working out of a long tradition of competition with Catholicism, and its 1905 separation of church and state is really giving the state freedom from religion. That's the driving force. And in the United States, it's a totally different. It's society that represented at least 5 different established churches at that time. 4 different established churches, if you look at 13 in the United States, had established churches, but there were 4 different churches. So really what we wanted was, the only thing I agree about is freedom of religion from the state. From my viewpoint, both the French and the American ones will probably are about to cause some problems for the twin tolerations, and that is that the correct space of freedom of democratic authorities from religious demands, I think there's a problem with that in the United States somewhat, and the correct space of the liberty for religions from the state. And there may be some problems with that. There certainly is in Turkey, but there may be some in France in terms of giving the state the flexibility and society the flexibility to act in that. But even if we forget the Scandinavians and look at the French and American ones, there's a huge difference. Because in fact, if you take a look at India, if you take a look at Indonesia, and if you take a look at Senegal. Now, first of all, these are 3 of the highest ranked democracies in poor countries in the world. All of them have a form of relationship between church and state that I call equal respect, equal support, and equal respect and equal support, and this really means a lot of support. So it means you support churches, you help build mosques that are falling down, churches, synagogues, you help people go on pilgrimages. So in Senegal, Catholics are supported to go to the Vatican to fulfill their religious missions, and in BJP India, the fundamentalist BJP government, close to fundamentals, still paid for Muslims to fulfill their religious obligation at Hajj. One of the 3 terminals in India is the Hajj terminal in Delhi. So it's a deep part of supporting religion. Now, we have to ask ourselves, does this violate democracy? Well, evidently not. Because when we take a look at what are the longest standing democracies in the developing world and really poor countries, they're what are the highest ranked at the moment. I mean, Ted Gore's Demos analysis ranks Senegal and Indonesia on a 21-point scale, -10, +10, and 8 right now. And India's there too. So these are absolutely the highest. And not all of them violate American type of total separation of church and state, but they don't violate democracy. Crucial. And then, violence. Then the question of whether some types of religions are more supportive of democracy than others, or more different. Well, obviously, if we just do a very simple exercise, we'll take a look at Islam. Let's ask ourselves, what's a necessary but not sufficient condition for democracy? A necessary but not sufficient condition for democracy is free and fair elections about the most important offices and the winner's pool. It's not sufficient, it's not the total definition of democracy, because you can meet those conditions and still not write a democratic constitution, a majoritarian constitution. Or you can not have the vertical and horizontal checks on the executive, and you can violate democracy. But of the countries that satisfy those conditions, if we just take the 47 Muslim majority countries in the world and divide them into between Arabs and non-Arabs, for the last 30 years, every country, and there have been 15, we've had 5 consecutive years that met my definition, are all non-Arabs. Okay? Now, what does that mean, methodologically? Methodologically, it means if you establish a set, and everyone's in the set, and they share a major variable, and you can then make 2 subsets which have wildly different political outcomes, then the major variable they share in common, in this case Islam, cannot explain that difference. Now, I've not eliminated Islam as a variable for comparatives to think about. What I have done is say it has to be with something else. So we have to say what's going on in Arab countries and what's going on in these other countries. Well, what's going on in Senegal is that a variety of things, they call themselves secular because they're French, but they call themselves secular, well understood, and well practiced. It's even in the Constitution. Secularism, well understood and well practiced. And it means just what I've said, that that the state recognizes all religions, and all religions reciprocally go to every public ceremony of the state, and they're all in attendance. And they respect each other, because there's different varieties of Islam and different varieties of how different countries appropriate it. Now, I'm not saying Sufi is always as nice as I think it is in Senegal, but it's maybe the only Sufi country where they have never been repressed, and they are the majority, and at least they've appropriated a form of Sufism in which they say the most important thing about Sufism is that God isn't every human being. Now, if God isn't every human being, how can you possibly use violence about a matter of difference of religion of that other person? So people physically put their arms up like this, as if it's just a horrible violation of their understanding of the godless in other people and what's required. Now, they quickly will give you they'll select out of all our religions are multiple. Notice all our religions have some non-democratic elements and some that are useful. What they do, particularly the religious leaders, is hit on and select the 4 or 5 things that are very useful, and they'll tell you. And what they'll tell you, in matters of religion, there can be no difference. And they'll say quickly, well, obviously this makes sense, God is in everything. And so it goes on. And this has a huge difference. This close relationship between a highly religious active population and the secular state. Secularism is well practiced and well understood. This secular state talks with religious leaders and say, look, we have a common problem. Really, a lot of people, if they don't change their sexual practices, are going to get AIDS. So the Catholic churches, the Muslim churches, from all 4 of the major Sufi orders, all participated in the sex education campaign. All of them, from their mosque and their Catholic church, held condoms up. All of them appeared on television. And Senegal has a 1% age rate. And this could never have been done without working together. They changed, not as far as they would like to go, but they changed the Family Act in a direction of giving women vastly more rights. There's still some things in feminism that say it's not far enough, but in terms of African standing and so on, they really pushed it in a direction that women might not be able to. I'll just conclude by statements about schooling. We all know about Pakistan. Well, they know about Pakistan. And they also were offered a lot of Saudi money and a lot of Iranian money for their own schools. And they say, and John's got a great book on this, unfortunately you've got a Mali chapter, you don't have a Senegal chapter, but the Senegal chapter will look like Indonesia and very unlike Pakistan. And that is that basically they know that that a vacuum is occupied. They don't want a vacuum. So 40% of the budget in the last 5 years has been for education. So all but 15% of the kids have a state school that they can go to. And then because you give money to the madrasa, to the religious schools, then they say, well, in return for the money, why don't we'll have some state inspection because it would be very good for your children if you're accredited. That's their job. And we'll co-author the books. I've talked to a lot of the religious preachers, including the grandson of the highest leader of the Marids. And he says he co-participated in this with the state, and it's a perfectly acceptable history of Islam. So in this context, where Iran and Saudi Arabia were initially coming in with Wahhabis, they said, well, you actually don't understand that politics. They're very far from the Senegalese idea of social practice and of violence and acceptance. So, and they almost said what we said, that religion should be about reaching out and establishing commonalities. They said, well, Wahhabis don't do that. So we don't. But we're not going to say that Wahhabis can't come here. But we're going to create a space where there's not much need for it. So, and the fact is, there's hardly any Iranian, any Saudi Arabian support for these schools, because they're all done by Senegalese who practice what I call in my article, rituals of respect to each other. Thanks very much.
Thank you. We've had 3 very stimulating, wide-ranging presentations. I think you've already been able to see some connections here on the panel and in the audience. I want to make sure we have time for a broad conversation, but I thought I'd just, technology willing, I thought I would say a few words about the contributions of each paper, some of the common themes, pose a few questions, not ask the panelists to respond right away to those questions, because we do want to get to the audience and have the better part of half an hour for a broader discussion. Paul Freston's paper covers some familiar ground in the context of Latin America and some not so familiar ground. We know about the role of the Catholic Church in Latin America in supporting autocracy. We know about this about-face since Vatican II and the role of the Catholic Church and the laity in pressing for democracy throughout the region. And he retells that story in all its complexity very effectively in his paper, but he also brings in the Pentecostals, the evangelicals, Protestant movements which traditionally from their own self-understanding begin with individual conscience and are not as politically engaged, but are, because they are growing in all kinds of communities across the region, increasingly important political actors. And his paper gives us a view of the diversity of their perspectives, their engagement across human rights agendas, issues of civil rights, of religious freedom, but also what he calls welfare issues. One question I had that I hope we get to in the discussion is a sort of hemispheric dynamic, the role of the United States as a political actor, but also the role of transnational religious organizations, churches, movements based in the United States within the region in shaping the dynamics that he describes. Rogaya, in her paper, takes us to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and the issue is here a human rights issue with a transnational and international dimension, what she calls gender justice. She extends the story in 2 ways. beyond the very familiar, or more familiar, I would say, activism, transnational activism against the practice of female genital mutilation, to illuminate local and national movements, transnational movements within Africa, increasingly opposed to this practice. And she highlights the role of religious leaders. Again, this is sort of counterintuitive, given what we know and understand of particularly the church's opposition to various sexual practices throughout the region, and the secular opposition to the church in the context of gender justice as an obstacle to human rights. What she shows us are various strategies on the ground, often below the radar, of religious leaders redefining terms, secular and religious leaders putting their heads together, appealing to religious discourses, theologies, what we might call theologies of the body, for example, in an effort to change the cultural backdrop of acceptance for these practices across the region. My question to you, Ragaya, is how this pattern that you see, this very hopeful pattern of religious-secular interaction, is or is not evident in other areas of what you call gender justice, say women's access to education, civil rights, the courts, and so on. Al Stepan took us in two directions, both very fruitful. A general direction, placing our context here, or our papers here in our conference in a broader theoretical context, work on democracy, democratic theory, human rights, and how it relates to religion. And then he took us into the very interesting case of Senegal, which in the French colonial or post-colonial tradition has a secular state, but yes and, or yes but, or maybe not really a secular state, which is a space for religious groups from different traditions to interact with the support, symbolic support of state institutions, and supporting a political culture that across religious institutions and across the secular religious divide is broadly supportive of a human rights culture. And of course the question there that you touched on, and maybe you can speak a bit more to in our conversation, is, are these rituals of respect that you describe in your paper, are they portable, are they a model for Senegal, but also for other regions? So what are the conditions under which these rituals can take root? A couple of the broad themes that I think these papers touch on, and I've touched on already in my quick synopsis. One is the interreligious dynamic, or in the case of Latin America, the interdenominational dynamic. We've got engagement of religious groups increasingly in a very pluralistic context conditioned by globalization, the interaction of Catholics and Protestants in Latin America, Christians and Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa, and Christians, Muslims, and secular authorities in Senegal. And what we see in this interaction are the fault lines around human rights that run not so much between these various groups, but also, perhaps most importantly, within them, a struggle over different conceptions of human rights within these various traditions. That's something that was highlighted by Ken Roth yesterday, and that we see again today. We have to be careful about making monolithic assertions about religion and human rights in general, about particular religious traditions and human rights in general, because they are so internally diverse and are engaging one another in this very pluralistic context where you see all kinds of interesting cross-cutting alliances. The second point I point to that comes out, I think, most strongly in Al Stepan's paper is the importance of state institutions. We have to think about, we have to conceive of the interaction between religion and human rights within the context of the state, within the context of democratic institutions, non-democratic institutions. We know a lot about, we know more in the literature about the role of religious institutions, the Catholic Church, for example, in supporting the process of democratization around the world in Latin America, as Paul mentioned. We know less about the mobilization of religious groups within those state institutions. And I think the case of sub-Saharan Africa makes the important point that you need, and this is something that Al mentioned as well, you don't just need democracy, you need a stable state, you need a stable framework within which the politics of human rights can be pursued, deals can be struck, and laws can be implemented. So those are just two general points about the interreligious dynamic, about the importance of the state. Other things that I could point to, and I hope we might get to in the discussion, themes that cut across these papers: the importance of colonial and post-colonial legacies, the link between religious diversity and ethnic diversity in driving the politics of human rights in these and other cases, the importance of class and social and economic inequality as a framing force in these cases and others. So we've got a lot to talk about. We don't have all that much time. We've got 25 minutes. I will give the panelists a chance to respond to my individual question very briefly, perhaps, or you can put that off. And actually, let's do this. Let's gather some questions from the audience, maybe 2 or 3, and bundle that with some of the comments that I've made. And that way we'll be sure to be able to cover as much ground as possible over the next 25 minutes. We have a microphone right here. Got a question in the back. We'll take 2 or 3.
Thank you. Yes. My name is Meg de Guzman. My question is mostly for Professor Steffen. About 15 years ago, I spent a year in Senegal on Fulbright looking at the syncretism between traditional religious practices and Islam, particularly in the Moorids, in a particular village with some Moori leaders. And I'm wondering whether you or anyone has looked at whether the presence of, I found not surprisingly that there's a very strong influence of traditional religious practices in Senegal, and as in many other sub-Saharan African countries. I'm wondering whether anyone's looked at whether the presence of such strong traditional religious influences on Islam, for example, makes a difference in terms of the degree of support that there is for democracy and the interplay there.
Let's take one more question.
My question is for Professor Steffen as well. If we look at how Islam spread all over Africa, many scholars agree that depending on whether Islam was spread through political conquest or through trade, for example, the outcome of how Islam relates to politics is very different. And I'm wondering if you would find some of these kind of arguments for the case of the peaceful Islam in Senegal. And second, how can the Senegalese model, for example, can be exported to other African countries where visibly we see that there is no peaceful relationship between Islam and other religions. Thank you.
Okay, your questions are accumulating fast now, so we better give you a chance to respond. Yeah.
Great. All excellent questions, and all ones that anyone like myself and you have to think about. I have a very special take on the question of syncretism. I happen to think that, I feel very unfortunate that much of the world, that the groups closest to a strict interpretation of Islam have appropriated the title of moderate. Okay? And then they call the other people syncretic, animist, traditionalist, and so on. Because actually, part of the reason that there's a reasonable amount of social peace in parts of Indonesia and parts of India and parts of Senegal is precisely because you're overlaying many traditions, just as you do in much of the West. I mean, it'd be crazy to think that Japan didn't use a lot of their traditions to make Japan Japan. And so when someone says we really have to go at all the syncretic forces, as the modernists said when they started coming into Senegal, it could be a problem, and they were resistant. So I think there's in the specific case of Senegal, those aspects that were usable for an effective democracy that came from African kingship, which still was dominant in the interior of Senegal in the 1820s and 30s, were a pretty prominent place for women. it was matrilineal. Women could own. Women could own property. Women were active in the economy and in the political system, and that part of traditional religion has stayed. And it's part of their response when they take a look at Arabs. They say, gee, we're Muslims, and they're Muslims, but we don't understand why they totally marginalize women from the polity. So this very singular response to where women are in their society, it's not totally equal, but it's much more equal than it would be in most of the Arab countries. Then whether the Senegalese model can be, and this was asked both by Tom and the question, I think we have to be cautious about the secondary characteristics of anyone's specificity are not only that, secondary characteristics of their specificity. And that's not an absolutely core part of democracy. So America has a huge intolerance of blocks of liberty, but a huge tolerance of inequality. That's a specificity of American democracy. That's not accepted by any Scandinavian country. And so it's one of the secondary characteristics. I think it erodes the quality of democracy in the United States, but it's different. So I think that some of the specific things in Senegal, probably the rituals of respect, can't be fully shifted because they came out of a very specific historical moment, but they're really worth thinking about. They're worth thinking about that you can have, why shouldn't the state, as in India or in Indonesia, support all religions? Why shouldn't the state, if it's faced with a vacuum, when children are not going to have state schools, and they're going to be given funding by foreign groups coming in that are not democratic in origins, why not make a big effort to support your local groups? But because you accredit them, this gives you an entrance. And I think those types of models are absolutely useful. I mean, I'm really upset when I read what happens in Pakistan, in the process. And I'm much less upset when I read Catherine's excellent edited book on the atrocities in Indonesia or the atrocities that I saw in Senegal. Let me conclude with a short statement about Rawls. Why did I think that was a tyrannical statement? It's and pernicious for the endeavor that we're looking at here. It's pernicious for the endeavor that we're addressing here because I think all of us understand that every world religion is multicultural. That is, they have elements that are highly against human rights and highly against democracy, but some that are useful for it. Now, if you're in a situation where someone is coming from your religion and is saying that these are truths and attacking the idea of rights and democracy, how can you take religion off the agenda? You better, someone in your religion, at some point, better violate some of the Rawls, at least in political liberalism book, requirements for public debate by talking about the specificity of religion and arguing against it, and arguing for that aspect of their religion in Islam that's fully compatible with human rights and fully compatible with democracy. And if you don't do that, it will be a disaster in India, it will be a disaster in Indonesia, and a total disaster in Senegal.
Okay, let's collect a few more questions. Right here. Please introduce yourself as well.
I'm Tom Farr. I have a question for Paul Freston. Two quick questions. You mentioned that in Latin America, the Roman Catholic Church had traditionally opposed Protestants, and particularly Pentecostals, by calling them sects and referring to them in that fashion. Under this Pope, we're beginning to see some changes in that. A lot of discussion coming out of the Vatican that this is wrong, and it's incompatible with Vatican II. Are you aware of that, and are you seeing any evidence on the ground in Latin America that among the church in Brazil or Peru or elsewhere, Chile, that this might be having an effect? And secondly, just briefly, could you elaborate on your point, which I think you made concerning the Roman Catholic Church in Peru, that its conservative nature was having a positive impact on the Pentecostals there, unless I misunderstood that.
Question?
Charles Skies, University of Washington. This question really stems from your paper on women and gender, but it's a broader question that came up when I was listening to Professor Stefan's comment about syncretism. One of the questions I have when we look at religion and human rights is why human rights groups almost never support the rights of what we call spirit mediumship, cults that are really women-centered. And these are indigenous cults oftentimes, but they are really the place where women get the most chance to express themselves. And I think this is something we need to put on our agenda, is these groups almost never, these religious groups almost never get attention by human rights.
Okay, we've got a question for each of you. Paul, would you like to start? Yes, sects, yes. I think it's too early really to take much of a change. Of course, there doesn't have to be an automatic relationship between what is key. You know, there's been a Catholic Pentecostal dialogue going on for goodness knows how long at the official level, but that is scarcely known about in most of Latin America, and really doesn't have, really the lack of knowledge of Pentecostalism is quite astonishing, including amongst progressive theologians. So I would expect there to be some time lag before any new emphasis works its way through. Now, I mean, there have always been dissident voices. There have always been people saying, no, this isn't the way we should refer to them, and not just a question of using the word, but a question of the whole attitude, mindset behind the use of the word. So there's always been people who've said, no, we ought to have a different posture. But I would say on the whole, the pejorative use of the term sex has predominated. With regard to Peru, what I meant was, even though, of course, Gustavo Gutierrez is Peruvian, but on the whole, the church has been pretty conservative, and there's a lot of influence of Opus Dei and so on. And that, in the context of religious rivalry and so on, has meant that you haven't had a situation in which certain themes have been preempted, as it were, by the Catholic Church. And that seems to leave more space for evangelicals to move in. Obviously, you'll always have some who will say, well, we should be doing certain things whether the Catholics are doing it or not. That's not the point. But for that group to find echo amongst a larger sector of the evangelical community, the relative position of the Catholic Church does have an effect. And I think that in recent times there has been a relative shift in the perception that the perception of the Catholic Church is associated with the left has diminished. And that has opened up space for a greater movement amongst more left-wing sectors in the evangelical world. So the dynamic of the religious field does have an effect. Just very briefly, your question, Tom, about the hemispheric dynamic. Yes, I mean, obviously the whole question of international contacts in general is very important. I think it's absolutely vital. You can't really make much sense of what goes on, both in the Catholic and the Protestant worlds, without an analysis of the international dynamics. And of course, the fact that you have the Cold War context in Latin America as a key site of Cold War struggles, especially after Cuba, plus the fact that, of course, you had a great shift of Protestant missionaries after China, after the Chinese Revolution, a great shift. So you also had a great influx of American Catholic missionaries at the same time, but somewhat in a different fashion, I would say, not with the same degree of sentimentality. And I think obviously the role of American Catholicism in Vatican II, in the sense of the change in Vatican II, especially religious freedom and so on, is often stressed. And I think in more recent times, to the extent that the religious field in Latin America has shifted somewhat, stressed somewhat, in the direction of the American religious field, and shifted away somewhat from Latin Europe, to that extent, American Catholic experience and models of functioning become more useful or relevant for thinking about from the point of view of the Latin American Catholic Church in dealing with this new pluralist situation. I do talk a little bit at the end of the paper. I apologize that most of you don't have, you only have a very short section of my paper. The rest of it wasn't done in time, and I'm not even sure whether Tom had the last part, where I do talk a little bit about recent changes in American evangelical attitudes toward human rights, and whether that would have an effect on Latin America. And of course, part of the problem is that, again, things are not automatic. In principle, there might be the potential for some effect there, but the fact is that there is a bit of a geopolitical rift within the evangelical world over Iraq and the war on terror, and this has been clearly detected by the Pew data that was produced last year. So, you know, there is no necessary geopolitical link. In fact, it's ironic that Pentecostals in the Latin American countries surveyed, Brazil, Chile, and Guatemala, are actually less favorable towards the so-called war on terror than their fellow citizens who are not Pentecostals. So much for the idea that becoming Pentecostal makes, increases American soft power around the world.
Okay, with respect to Tom's question about other areas such as education, for talking about local articulations of gender justice, I just wanted to point out that in the different campaigns in Africa to end female genital mutilation, the practice is not targeted for eradication in isolation of other issues of education and the strengthening of women's capacities. So that is part of larger sort of capacity building. This is the popular phrase now, but and empowerment. The issue which is related to that and to the question which you rightly raised about indigenous beliefs and indigenous systems in which women-centered rites of passage and rituals are glossed over. I think you are absolutely right. And I think initially when we talk about religion and human rights, that can go back to colonialism. When we take the example for the eradication efforts in Kenya, we find that there was a great conflict between the British administration and local, indigenous rites of passage performances, to the extent that Kenyans, especially the Kikuyus, decided to form their own independent churches. They didn't want to deal with the coerciveness of the colonial state in questions about cultural sovereignty. The same thing happened in the Sudan. As a matter of fact, I had just a conversation with Paul about Sufism in Islam and in Sudan, and one of the most significant opposition movements against the eradication of female circumcision came from so-called Republican brothers, Akhwan al-Jamhuriyin. a Sufist group, who again appropriated the law and the ban against female circumcision to try to pose larger questions about nationalism and about Sudanese ability to govern themselves. So again, you have intermingling of different local, national, and international politics. But you are absolutely right. And what is happening right now in terms of amplifying these indigenous women-centered rituals is the incorporation of people in different activities and different campaigns. I can think of the traditional excisers. They call it training of trainers. This is usually the language of NGOs. But some of them really come from what we call noble spiritual beliefs, neither Islamic nor Christian, but they wielded considerable power in ritual performance. They have been incorporated and their views really fortified within different campaigns to promote reproductive health.
Let's take the time remaining, which isn't much, to take 2 more questions from the audience. Right next to you.
Thank you very much, Bob Hefner from the conference. Thank you to all 3 presenters for what I thought were really excellent kickstart papers. I have very, very positive reactions to all 3, but I'm going to just limit myself to one question to Professor Musharraf concerning the whole question of female genital mutilation and the grounds whereby one critiques it. Obviously, as you know much better than I, there's been a lively sort of counter-discourse, even on the part of people such as many scholars who point out that female genital mutilation is not consistent with Islam, at least as they interpret it, and indeed it's not practiced in much, perhaps most of the Muslim world, I think. But there's been a discourse which has implicitly raised the question as to the grounds whereby one challenges such practices. And the question I have, just to cut through the sort of haze of that broader background, is do you think that there are grounds, or that there need to be grounds of a non-liberal nature to justify challenges to female genital mutilation? Or do you think that the grounds for a human rights challenge to female genital mutilation build more or less on the same liberal notions of human rights that we typically associate with human rights?
Okay, final question up here in front.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Simone. This question is also for Madam Abu Sharif. As we were discussing feminine FGM and the question of human rights and women's rights and gender justice, I get the overwhelming sensation, at least in the past 5 years, that the whole FGM discussion has hijacked, in essence, the whole question of women's rights, gender rights, and human rights. I think there needs to be greater discussion on access to property, on property and inheritance rights, access and equality before the rule of law, and also expansion of economic possibilities. I think as moving forward in human rights, where you solving or addressing a cultural issue without addressing the wider perspective of equality, I think we're doing ourselves and we're doing women a disservice. And I'd like you to comment on that. Thank you.
Okay, I think your question is well taken. I have collaborated with African scholars and activists to talk specifically about that issue. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, that FGM cannot be isolated from other efforts to strengthen women's access to political, economic, and social resources. And in the different examples and case studies that I have edited in the female circumcision book is exactly about illuminating the ways in which people can include local ideas about rights that are not necessarily liberal. I think there are grounds for people to make the case about ending female circumcision. There is no doubt about that, because when you talk about questions of health and you talk about questions of, I don't want to talk about consent and the fact that little girls, you know, as little as 3 and 2 years old are being circumcised. I don't want to participate in the continuing representation and or misrepresentations of Africa. What I'm trying to say is that there are numerous local efforts drawing from indigenous thought systems to talk about change. And that change, as I said, is not just about making decisions about female circumcision. As I pointed out in the framework of looking at gender justice, it's also about early marriage, it's about different opportunities for women to negotiate access to power, to political decision making, and so on. I think what is extremely useful, as I pointed out in the case of the African Union, is that it made it very specific that when you talk about the violence against women, the Maputo Declaration, is also you have to talk about the different subject positions, you know, for women as citizens who have rights and responsibilities. And they have to understand and negotiate that on equal terms. And that is exactly, rather than talking about FGM as an entry into a conversation about religion and human rights, I talk about the broader frame of gender justice, how it is understood by African women. There is significant African feminism and activism right now for understanding different and locally based ideas about rights and roles.
Thank you. This session I have to draw to a close. I want to note a couple of things. One is that all the papers have been submitted, and they're great papers, and if you're interested in learning more, they will be posted on the Berkley Center website early next week. So please come back and look for the papers. I also, since we've only just scratched the surface this morning, want to alert you to the panels this afternoon, one at 1:45 in this same room, looking at Islam and human rights and transnational perspective, where we'll be able to pick up some of the strands from this morning's conversation. And one at 3:45, again here, we'll have a coffee break in between on human rights in Asia and in Russia in comparative perspective. So thanks again for coming, and please in closing, join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful presentation.